Thank you all for coming today. I suppose this is not a bad way to spend the afternoon at Google, having a couple of beers and listening to me talk about my book a little. What I'm going to do is kind of outline for you the book, hopefully talking about some interesting stories that are in the book. I want to say up front that, you know, I am the co-founder of the Brooklyn Brewery since 1988, and the reason I think I'm qualified to write such a book is I've gotten to know most of the pioneers and founders of the whole craft beer movement, and I've been involved in it pretty intimately from the beginning through our association, the Brewers Association. And like many of my generation of craft brewer, you know, people who started in the 1980s, I had a career before I got into the beer business. I was a journalist. I graduated from college in the early 70s. I had a degree in English, and I tried teaching high school and almost had a nervous breakdown. It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life, teaching senior English, you know, to the bright class and the dumb class. Both of them were terrifying for me. I was never the most well-behaved student, and as a teacher, it seemed like every day was payback for the way I treated my teachers back in the day. So I realized I couldn't teach, and so I got a job with a newspaper in upstate New York, and I worked for small newspapers for a couple of years, and I got my big chance job with Associated Press in Newark, New Jersey in 1976. And for reasons I usually go into after I've had about 4 beers, I got in my head I wanted to cover a war, and if you work for AP, you can do that. So I started studying Arabic and said I wanted to go to Beirut. And I learned there aren't too many people who want to go to Beirut and cover wars. So like a year after I volunteered, I landed in Beirut as the Middle East correspondent for AP. That was February '79, when the Shah was being overthrown in Iran and Ayatollah Khomeini was coming to power. So I went to Iran and covered kind of the tail end of the revolution and the hostage crisis. I know many of you are very young, but you know the movie Argo? It's that period. So I was in Iran for that. I got thrown out of Iran eventually by the government. I went back into Iran the next year with the Iraqi army when they invaded Iran. I covered that war from the Iraqi side, and I don't know if any of you served in Iraq, but if you know anything about working with the Iraqi army, it's pretty exciting. I lived in Beirut. In Beirut we had the civil war ongoing, and eventually the Israeli invasion, the massacres in the refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila. I covered those stories. Moved to Cairo, and I was sitting behind President Sadat when he was killed at the parade in 1981. So, you know, I covered a lot of big stories. It was actually pretty good training for starting a brewery in Brooklyn. I'm not kidding. And when I was in Cairo, I met American diplomats who had worked in Saudi Arabia. They'd had 3-year postings in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has pretty strict prohibition on alcoholic beverages. So these guys were avid homebrewers. They had gotten into homebrewing in Saudi, and they continued in Egypt because the beer in Egypt was not very good. It was reputed to have a little dose of formaldehyde in it. So it was, you know, as a preservative. And, you know, you could feel your lips getting a little numb after the first few sips of Egyptian beer. So anyway, these guys made homebrewed beer. And then my wife, who was with me through not the whole thing, but much of my years in the Middle East, we had our first child. Actually, Sam was born in Beirut during the war. Lily, our daughter, was born in Cairo. And AP wanted me to go to the Philippines next because President Marcos was in trouble. And, you know, I was a conflict reporter. That's what I did. I was really excited about this. And my wife said, no, I'm not taking the kids to the Philippines. I'm going back to New York. I hope you come with me, but, you know, if not, have a nice life. So I gave it up and came back to New York and went to work for Newsday, doing foreign news for Newsday, living in Brooklyn and making beer at home, you know, home brewing. And eventually with my downstairs neighbor, Tom Potter, who was a young guy with an MBA who'd always wanted to start his own business, I convinced him that it was not, you know, a completely lunatic thing to try to start a brewery. And we started Brooklyn Brewery. I count, you know, that was 1988 when we sold our first beer. I count myself among the, what I call in the book, the first generation of craft brewers. And that's different than the pioneers. The pioneers I describe as a period from 1965 when Fritz Maytag from the Maytag washing machine fortune bought an old failing brewery in San Francisco called the Anchor Brewing Company and brought back Anchor Steam beer, which was a particular kind of beer, a lager beer actually brewed at warmer temperatures like an ale to produce this special style called steam. And a lot of different explanations of where steam came from, you know, had to do with steam engine, the era of steam engines, or when you tap the keg, you got a little puff of steam off the beer, but you know, you get that off any beer. But anyway, enough of that. So Fritz was the first guy to bring back traditionally brewed beer. So 100% malted barley, no rice or corn like the big brewers. And he was alone in this pursuit until 1978. And there was a guy named Jack McAuliffe who had been in the US Navy based in Scotland. He was a submariner. And he got into home brewing when he was in Scotland. And, you know, in England, that was in UK, that was the era of real ale and the campaign for real ale, which was a movement to preserve the traditional style of brewing and serving ale in England. So Jack is a real entrepreneur, a very quirky personality. Jack started New Albion Brewery in Sonoma, and that was really the first home-built brewery. You know, so it was made out of cobbled together parts, soda, you know, Pepsi tanks and dairy tanks and all that sort of thing. And actually, his two partners were Jane Zimmerman and I'm spacing on the name of the second woman, but it was two women, and they were intimately involved in brewing the beer. Actually, one of them was intimately involved with Jack, but that, you know, that's a different story. But they made the first beer, New Albion Ale, and Susie Dennison was the second woman. They made New Albion Ale, and that was really kind of the first, you know, built from the ground up brewery. Very different than Fritz Maytag, who, you know, I always felt Fritz was kind of playing with a different sheet of music than the rest of us because he had a fortune behind him. Jack did not. But that only lasted about 6 years, but it had a huge impact on several important people like Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada, Paul Shipman from Red Hook. Actually, I was talking to John Hall from Goose Island in Chicago recently, and he told me he visited New Albion also. So a lot of people who were homebrewing at that time kind of flocked to New Albion and were inspired from what Jack and his partners were doing. Actually, I remember Ken Grossman saying something like, you know, what Jack was doing was just kind of a glorified homebrewing operation. You know, Ken started his brewery in Chico in a garage, basically cobbling things together the same way Jack had done. And, you know, it was kind of a period of, you know, kind of struggling to sell this stuff because nobody knew what craft beer was. No, you know, it was called microbrewed beer then. Actually, that term microbrewery came from a guy who was working for Charlie Papazian. Charlie Papazian is the founder of the Great American Beer Festival and Zymergy magazine, which how many of you are homebrewers, by the way? Oh shit, you probably, you know all this stuff, right? Well, you know, stop me if I'm getting too detailed here. But actually there was a guy working for Charlie who was a software engineer, and he coined the term microbrewery. I mean, you know, he basically said to Charlie at one point, said, you know, these people starting these small breweries, they're kind of like microprocessors. These are microbreweries. And that's where that term came from. And it endured for quite a while. Today we call a microbrewery a brewery that's making fewer than 15,000 barrels a year. And actually it's a very fast growing segment of craft beer now in America. Fritz talks about the early days, about how difficult it was to sell the beer because people just didn't understand what he was doing. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was from Mars or something like that. And he talked about how they had to dump a lot of beer because they would brew the beer, but they couldn't sell it quickly enough and it would go bad, so they'd have to dump it down the sewer, and you know, that's a very painful thing for any brewer to do, I can tell you. There's an interesting story about Red Hook, which I think illustrates a lot of the way things were back with the pioneers. Red Hook Brewery in Seattle, started by Paul Shipman, who was a wine salesman. Shipman was determined that he was going to brew a really original beer. So he didn't want to use any brewer's yeast from any of the institutions that, you know, catalog different yeast. So he got a yeast from a professor at the University of Washington, and they made Red Hook Ale, and they set a date for the opening of the brewery in Seattle at a pub. And, you know, a few days before the opening, they realized the beer really didn't taste very good. It was off. But, you know, they had committed to the date, and it had been in the press, so they forged ahead. They had the big day with the mayor and all the politicians and a lot of dignitaries. They tapped the keg, they poured the beer. Everyone tasted the beer and kind of looked at each other like, oh yeah, this is great. But they knew it really wasn't. You know, leave it to the journalist. There was a reporter there from the Seattle newspaper who wrote what everyone was thinking, which is, this tastes like rotten bananas. You know, this is not the way it should be. But Shipman, you know, like any entrepreneur, was very determined, and he forged ahead with this beer. And, you know, for about a year, they kind of limped along selling this beer that people were excited about because they loved the idea of a local brewery there in Seattle, but they all knew it didn't taste very good. And the feedback they were getting from their customers was, you know, people order 1 pint of this, then they kind of drink half of it, and then they order Coors Light for the next beer. But Shipman was determined. So Michael Jackson came to town, and I hope, I'm sure as homebrewers, you all know which Michael Jackson I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the British beer writer who was incredibly influential for the craft beer movement in America and all over the world, for that matter. His 1977 World Guide to Beer made experts of myself and, you know, many of you, I'm sure. Michael did incredible research into brewing and visited virtually every brewery on the planet. So Michael never said anything bad about any craft brewery. He was a total supporter of the movement in the US. So he came to Seattle and he tasted the Red Hook beer. And of course there was great anticipation, this is Michael Jackson tasting my beer. So Michael kind of swirled it around and he said, this is kind of like a Belgian beer. And, Shipman, the ultimate salesman, said, exactly, Michael, it's a Belgian style beer. So they changed all the copy on their label to say it's a Belgian style beer. And all the marketing copy, it's like we got this great Belgian style beer. And then, but still the stuff was not selling well. Then another guy came to town who actually turned out to be a very important man in the history of craft beer, named Joe Owates. Joe Owates is a brewing chemist who he died, I think last year. Most famous for, he's the father of light beer. He created diet beer at the Rheingold Brewery in Brooklyn, I think in the 60s. And the marketing geniuses at Rheingold named the beer Gablingers, which is not the most appetizing name for a beer. And it totally flopped. It wasn't until Miller Lite in the 70s and 80s, got into marketing light beer, that light beer really took off. But Joe was the guy who created it. And he's a brewing chemist, a very natty dresser with a pencil mustache, very German, very blunt and iconoclastic. So Owates came to Seattle, and he at the time he was teaching brewing at Anchor in San Francisco. He had a program there. So he came to Seattle and he tasted the Red Hook Ale. And he turned to Paul Shipman and said, is this made for some unusual ethnic group here in Seattle or something? And Shipman, the ultimate salesman, is like, no, Joe, this is our Belgian style ale. And Owates looks at him and says, no, it's not. It's infected. Let me show you how to make beer. And he advised them on a yeast to buy from the Siebel Institute in Chicago. And they changed the yeast, they renamed the beer Ballard Bitter, and Red Hook took off. I love that story because it kind of describes what it was like being a pioneer with this whole thing and trying to do something original and failing, but pushing ahead with it and eventually figuring it out. Also, the involvement of Michael Jackson. Michael was so important in this whole craft beer revolution. We did many events with Michael here in New York in the 80s, and he did so much to educate people about beer and laid the groundwork for this whole thing. And Owates eventually consulted for many craft brewers, including us at Brooklyn Brewery. He actually wrote the recipe for Sam Adams Boston Lager. I mean, it was based on Jim Koch's family, his grandfather's recipe, but Joe was the guy who actually put it together. He worked for, I think he worked at Sierra. He worked at many breweries over the year as a consultant because he was a real expert, really interesting guy. I was at a dinner at Anchor several years ago that Fritz Maytag threw, and I was sitting next to Joe on my left. On my right was Gary Fish from Deschutes Brewery, and Gary's one of my closest friends in the beer business. And Gary's flagship brand was Black Butte Porter, which of course is a dark beer. And I knew that Joe didn't like dark beer, but I said, Joe, you got to try Gary's porter here. And Joe said, I don't care for dark beer. And I said, I know, but Joe, this is Gary's #1 brand. I mean, this is his flagship there in Oregon. And Owates looked at me and said, yes, and some people like burnt toast. You can't make up these characters. So my generation were inspired by the likes of Sierra Nevada and Red Hook, and these breweries, mostly out west. There were only a couple in the east. There was Newman's Albany Amber up in Albany. I don't know if any of you remember that. Some of you, one of you does, yeah. Bill Newman made incredible beer, just fantastic beer. But, you know, I swear he couldn't sell water to a starving man. He was a terrible salesman. Then there were, here in New York City, there was Matthew Reich with New Amsterdam, a beer that was actually also created along with Joe Oates. And New Amsterdam was the first, actually they were way ahead of everybody back in the 80s, way ahead of Sam Adams, way ahead of everyone. And Matthew was the guy who started contract brewing, the concept of contract brewing. He made his beer at the Utica Brewery up in Utica, New York, where we actually started out too. When I started with Brooklyn Brewery, there was a reporter from Manhattan Inc. magazine that called up Matthew, and by this time he had built an incredible brewery on 11th Avenue and 26th Street. In the city, and the reporter asked Matthew what he thought of this Brooklyn Brewery project, and Matthew said, "I hope those guys fall flat on their faces. They've stolen every idea I ever had," which is kind of true, you know. I mean, we really learned, we all learned from the people who came before us. I mean, that's the way the whole thing got built. And, you know, Jim Cook with Sam Adams learned a lot from Matthew, and Jim, of course, contract brewed at the beginning of his company also. That was kind of the way it was back in the 80s. We all were kind of focused on making all malt beer and pretty traditional styles, like an amber ale, an amber lager, a porter, a stout, you know, often promoting the idea that we're making beer by the Reinheitsgebot, the German purity law, only using, you know, the 4 basic ingredients of beer. Those were sort of the hallmarks of my generation starting out. The 90s were just a crazy time for craft beer. There were, you know, a lot of money came in, a lot of venture capital. You know, it was the dot-com years. A lot of venture capital came into the brewing industry as well as, you know, the tech industry. There were like six or seven companies that went public. Only one of them really succeeded, and that's Boston Beer, Sam Adams. All the others, in one way or another, screwed up as public companies. You know, and I think the reasons were that you know, they were too small, they were too young really to be committing to the kind of reporting that you have to do as a public company, and the demands of the market once you're a public company. So the only one that succeeded was Sam Adams. The big brewers started to aggressively attack craft breweries, including Anheuser-Busch really went after Sam Adams in a big way in the 90s with television ads calling them out for, you know, making contract brewed beer and saying they're fake breweries, they don't really have breweries. So a lot of stuff happened. A lot of those ones that went public kind of tanked, and the growth of craft beer really slowed down, like in the mid-90s. And the press basically, you know, was saying this whole microbrewed beer thing is over. And a lot of people bought it. Actually, a lot of craft brewers, if you talk to them about the 90s, will say the same thing. The interesting thing I uncovered when in writing this book is that far from a time of retrenchment, the craft brewing movement really laid the groundwork for the next explosion of craft beer during that period. Between 94 and I think 2000, there were like 1,000 breweries started. And it was a period of incredible innovation. New Belgium Brewery in Colorado started up making only Belgian style beers. Allagash up in Maine started up. Stone in San Diego, Russian River in California, Dogfish in Delaware. And these were all very creative, very inventive, very innovative brewers and breweries. Garrett Oliver joined us in 1994, and the first beer he did for Brooklyn Brewery was Brooklyn Black Chocolate Stout. Garrett had been the founder of the New York City Homebrewers Guild. I met him in like 1986. He was working for a big law firm. He quit and went to work for Manhattan Brewery, which was the first brew pub in the city, and he learned to brew there. Manhattan Brewery failed under like 3 different owners. It was like, the second owner was dumber than the first owner, and the third was the dumbest of all. They had great beer, they had a great location, but they just couldn't put it all together. And it really was poor leadership, I think. But Garrett learned to brew there. He joined us, and actually they were in bankruptcy when Garrett brewed the first Brooklyn Black Chocolate Stout at the Manhattan Brewery. And no one was paying any attention to what he was doing. He had the grain and he could do it. And that, Garrett talks about that as his resume for Brooklyn Brewery. So that was the first beer for us. The second Garrett did was Brooklyn East India Pale Ale, which is a very balanced IPA, which we, of course, it's still one of our big selling brands. That eventually led to the Belgian style beers that we make, and the wheat beers, and the incredible range that we now produce in Brooklyn. So when people talk about the 90s, craft beer almost disappeared, they're really wrong, because there was so much new energy coming into the craft beer world at that time that you just can't understate how important the 90s were for laying the groundwork for the future of craft beer. So I don't buy the shakeout idea. There were some spectacular failures. Pete's Wicked Ale went like this to like 400,000 barrels and then went down almost as quickly as it came up. Catamount up in Vermont, which was one of my generation of brewers, failed. They built a second brewery and then did not continue to grow, so they had taken a lot of debt to build that second brewery. They didn't grow, so they got squeezed and had to sell. Actually, Harpoon in Boston bought the Catamount Brewery back then. And then there were several things that happened that really kind of supercharged the whole movement. In the last 5 years, craft beer has grown at a very vigorous double-digit pace. Brooklyn Brewery has actually grown at like a 25% pace. In 2008, we sold 75,000 barrels of beer. Last year, we sold 220,000 barrels. So we tripled during that 5-year period. And the same has happened to a lot of craft breweries. There was several reasons why that happened, I think. Number one was the distributors, the big distributors in America, opened up to craft beer. For many years, the only choices we had as craft brewers when we're selling, well, Brooklyn, we distributed our own beer for 15 years because none of the big distributors in New York City were interested in us. And, believe me, I had no love of running a trucking company in New York City, but we kind of had to do it. And the only choice we had going into new markets was the Miller distributor or the Coors distributor, or a wine distributor for whom beer is like second class, or a craft beer distributor, of which there weren't too many. We were one, and we knew because we were one that craft beer distributors didn't have the capital really to make it go. And the whole Anheuser-Busch network of distributors for the most part, only carried Anheuser-Busch products. So that's like 50% of the US market of distribution is Anheuser-Busch. And we had no access to that distribution network. In the 90s, August Busch declared a policy of 100% share of mind. So he said to his distributors, if you only sell AB products, I will give you financial incentives and I'll make you rich, which he did actually, and most of them stuck to the 100% share of mind. But that all fell apart like in the last 10 years as craft beer began to grow and mainstream beer began to lag. And the Anheuser-Busch network opened up to craft beer. So, you know, it used to be when we go into a new market, we would prepare this big presentation and go to a distributor and tell them how we were going to sell the beer, Brooklyn beer, for them, how we were going to make them rich by you know, putting salesmen in their market, doing promotions. So basically we were trying to sell ourselves to them. After Anheuser-Busch distributors opened up to craft beer, suddenly you had competition between the Miller Coors people and the Anheuser-Busch and the wine guys. And now when we go into a new market, the distributors are presenting to us and telling us what they're going to do for us if we pick them for that market. So it's hard to describe how important that was. There are still a lot of problems between craft brewers and distributors, don't get me wrong. But that's been very important for the surge of craft beer in the last 10 years. Another big thing, and I probably don't have to tell you all this, is social media has been so important for craft brewers. Daniel Bradford, who's the editor, the publisher of All About Beer magazine, he was the publisher of Zymergy, the homebrew magazine, back in the 80s. And Daniel told me back then he did a survey of all the readers of Zymergy, and he found that 80% of them had PCs at home. And this was in the 80s, you know. I mean, computers were not, well, you know, they weren't so common back then. But homebrewers were definitely computer savvy. And that whole, you know, splintering of the media and the emergence of social media has been absolutely critical for craft brewers. And it's been a big problem for the big brewers. You know, for years, they were able to lock up the US market by their domination of the 3 big television networks. But, you know, all that is gone. It doesn't work anymore. And the big guys haven't really figured out how to communicate in this new world. And it kind of shows in what's happening with their sales, too. They've lost an incredible volume of sales in the last 5 years. At the end of this year, I think it'll be about 20 million barrels, which is about 10% of the whole US beer market. And during that same time, craft beer has been on this tear, you know, growing double digits, the whole segment. So you know, you can't overstate the importance of social media. You can start a little brewery today, and people are doing this, in the middle of nowhere, and the beer drinkers will know more about you than maybe you know about yourself. Because they're so into this and following what's happening, it's really quite amazing. And this is happening, it's happening all over the world. There are craft breweries opening up in a lot of places around the world because many, you know, the world is hooked on light lager beer the way America was for many years. And another important thing, and it's hard to overstate this too, is our association, the Brewers Association. You know, you'll hear a lot of people say that craft brewers are really collegial, that they cooperate with each other, that they work with each other, that you know, it's kind of this unusual situation where competitors get together and work together to build the category. But it's really true. And I attribute it to the Great American Beer Festival and the Craft Brewers Conference. It brings us together every year. And, you know, I have friends, brewer friends, all over the country. We come together, we talk about our problems, we talk about, you know, experiences, we trade war stories. And I've learned so much from, you know, people like Gary Fish at Deschutes or Kim Jordan at New Belgium, another one of my really close friends. It really is a very collegial atmosphere in craft beer. Even here in New York City, you know, there are 23 craft breweries in New York City now. Actually, I wrote a piece for Cranes, which is going to come out in September, about all the craft breweries in New York. New York has been very unfriendly to craft beer. We were really the only ones to succeed, you know, in the 80s and 90s. There were about 20 or 30 startups that failed during that period in New York City. You know, brew pubs and craft breweries. So the BA, the Brewers Association, has been an incredible force and power for craft brewers. We now have significant clout in Washington with the federal government. You know, we're a regulated industry. You've got to be involved in politics if you're going to be in the beer business, and in every state government. You know, homebrewing actually is legal now in 50 states. I think Alabama was the last one to legalize homebrewing, and that was through the efforts of the Brewers Association. Today, you have what I would call the third generation of craft brewers. And, you know, back in the 80s, when we used to go to the Craft Brewers Conference every year, there might be like 200 people or 300 people. And back then it was like, God, there are 300 people here, you know. This year at the Craft Brewers Conference in Denver, there were 10,000 people. I mean, I had to work to find my friends in the crowds. It was quite amazing. And the startups today, unlike my generation where we all had, you know, we all had jobs and careers before we started breweries, these are young people coming right out of college with business degrees or brewing degrees who are going right into this industry. And, you know, it's a very attractive industry. It's a lot of fun. It pays pretty well now, a lot better than it did when I started out. When I started out, you know, sort of taking a page from the tech industry, we would offer, you know, stock options to people joining Brooklyn Brewery. Because, I mean, I was paying myself $24,000 when we started in 1988. And, you know, I had been making more than twice that as a journalist even back in the day. But today, people, you can make a good living in the craft beer industry. And actually, if you know, get to a certain level, you can actually make quite a bit of money. So things have really changed. And this third generation, it's like it's a mix of everything that came before it. You know, you have all different kind of business models, and you have you know, one of the people I profile is this guy with Kodiak Island Brewing Company. Kodiak Island is off the coast of Alaska, over toward the Aleutians. There are more bears on Kodiak Island than there are people. But this guy, Ben Milstein, and his wife started this little brewery. I think there are like 20,000 people on the island. And their little brewery has become like the center of social life on that island. You know, the two senators from Alaska have visited Kodiak Island to talk about how great the brewery is. And actually, that's something I'm very proud about with Brooklyn Brewery, and I think all the craft breweries across the country have had very positive impacts on the communities where they've started, because most of us are very deeply involved in the communities where we're making beer. You know, if you're the person making the beer, you have an interesting kind of status in a community. And it's something I didn't really understand until I started doing it. You know, we don't do any advertising. We do a little bit with like Edible and you know, a few niche publications, but mainly we give away beer to not-for-profit organizations and causes we believe in, and that's how I got involved. Yeah, right, Mike. That's how I got involved with transportation alternatives and you know, Prospect Park. We give money to literally hundreds of organizations every year, beer or money, and that's the way we promote ourselves. We do the same thing in Stockholm, where we sell a lot of beer, or London, or Columbus, Ohio. We do this thing we call the Brooklyn Mash. It's a cultural festival we do in 12 cities. And it really celebrates the creative culture of the cities where we're doing the events. So we do food events, beer events, you know, comedy, literature, music, and all of it using local talent. We actually usually bring a comedian from New York to be part of the thing. But it's mainly, you know, it's kind of a craft beer way of selling beer. Actually the foreword to my book is written by John Hickenlooper. John started the Wynkoop Brewery in Denver in 1988, same year I started Brooklyn Brewery. Wynkoop was started in a neighborhood lower downtown. It was called Lodo, and it was the first sign of life down in Lodo for years. You know, that was like a warehouse district, kind of like where we, actually exactly like where we started in Brooklyn in the late 80s. John eventually ran for mayor of Denver and became mayor of Denver. And then he ran for governor of Colorado, and he's now governor of Colorado. So, you know, believe me, I have no interest in politics, but it's interesting how he parlayed his sort of revival of Denver into a political career. And actually, there's been talk of him being a vice presidential candidate. You know, Colorado's a swing state. And he's a very liberal guy, so you know, don't be surprised if he doesn't get paired up with Hillary down the road here. Also, you know, this new generation, they're following the same playbook when it comes to marketing and community involvement and all that kind of thing. They're making all different crazy kind of beers. I mean, the styles that are being explored are quite amazing. I think Ninkasi Brewery in Oregon just sent some yeast into outer space as part of the space shuttle. I'm not sure that's really going to go anywhere, but except up and down. But you know, the other day I did a Reddit thing for like 2 hours, and I responded to 231 people. And my favorite was a guy from Brazil who asked me if I had tried the new beer made with ants from Brazil. And I told him I had not, and I wasn't really eager to try. There's a beer in Iceland that is made with malt that has been smoked with sheep dung. Because you know, they don't have too many trees in Iceland, and actually it's a really good tasting beer. I couldn't really detect any animal character to the beer. And you know, of course, Sam Calagione has done incredible beers based on ancient Egypt and Babylon, and beers just, you know, it's an incredible, wonderful, inexpensive beverage. And a lot of people say to me, aren't you guys, you know, kind of turning beer into a snob beverage like wine? And, you know, the answer is no. You can have the best beers in the world in your cellar. They're all accessible to you, you know. Beer, whereas wine, you know, the CEOs of big companies have cellars that, you know, no one can even imagine owning. So wine is a whole different category than beer. Let's see, have I talked too long? Yeah, maybe I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. A lot of people ask me about the future of beer, and I just want to say that there are 3,000 breweries now in America. When I started, there were fewer than 50. There are like 2,000 breweries in planning right now. And I believe that America can easily absorb 5,000 breweries. Before Prohibition, there were 2,000 breweries in America, and the population was like 40, 50 million. The population now is 325 million. We can handle this. I think the future of craft beer, the successful craft breweries, are going to be the breweries that establish and maintain trust with their customers. You know, you drink Brooklyn because of you live in New York and you like the beer, and or you've been to the brewery, or we've given to your favorite charity or whatever. But you have faith in that brewery, and I think the breweries that succeed are going to be the ones that maintain that bond with the customers, because the beer drinkers have really made us. We didn't brainwash them with television advertising or radio advertising. They discovered us, and they kind of own us, and that's a relationship that's very precious for all craft brewers. Thank you.
Let's see, before we take questions, just a few quick announcements. First, thanks to Alan Seals and the Authors of Google team for making this talk possible. A lot of hard work behind the scenes. Thanks to Steve for sending us delicious beer. It's been really hard having that for the last month at my desk and not here it is for all of you. The books are for sale for $10 in the back corner. It's a subsidized price. And if you have questions, please use the mic right here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
How you doing, Steve?
Good.
So, craft brewer myself, in Brooklyn, Park Slope, backyard, your old stomping ground.
Uh-huh.
Shout out to the Brooklyn Blast, it's my favorite. I don't know if that's yours or Garrett's. Quick question, so I'm actually heading up to Amagang for their little camping session that they do every year.
Uh-huh.
I've been going there for years. Chimay bought them out in a couple of years, and you mentioned...
Not Chimay, Duvel.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, Mort got that.
But it's sort of like a trend that's going on. The same thing happened with Goose Island, bought out by Budweiser, and they were bought out by InBev. Where do you see that going? Like, it's almost like the startup situation that we have here, where if you come up with a good beer, you get bought out, or do you isolate, keep yourself contained, maintain just to your audience? Where do you see the future as far as that? Because I know obviously these agencies, these bigger companies, obviously know the power of craft beer. So if they see something, maybe a spark, do they buy it up, and do you get rich quick? Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think some people are going to sell. I mean, no question about it. John Hall from Goose Island sold to Anheuser-Busch. John started the same year I did. I know him very well, he and his son Greg. But Greg told his dad he really didn't want to do this for the rest of his life. So John is, at the time he sold it, I think he was 69 years old, and what are you going to do? He cashed out. I have no problem with that. I think for the big guys, craft beer is a real dilemma. Miller Coors makes Blue Moon. AB has Shock Top. Now they have Goose Island. They bought Blue Point out on Long Island a couple of months ago. They're going to play in our segment, no question about it. I don't think they can dominate our segment the way they've dominated, mainstream beer. Also, I think the more they play in our segment, the more they undercut their big brands. When I started in business, imports were 3% of the U.S. market. The other 97% was national brands. Today, imports are 13%. Craft beer is like more than 10%. And Miller Coors and AB InBev are 74%. So, arguably, we've pushed them back from like 97% to 74%. And it's going to continue, I think. They're going to buy craft breweries. You know, there's a guy I know who's on the board. I know a lot of the big brewers because I've been on their board for several years. They have one, token small guy on the board, and it's been me. One of the guys on the board of Miller Coors, I was having an argument with him one day. I said, Fritz, Blue Moon's a big brand. He said, Steve, it doesn't move the needle for us. It doesn't matter, And that's kind of the way they look at things. AB InBev last year sold 323 million barrels of beer worldwide. SAB Miller sold 210 million. Molson Coors sold 51 million. The whole craft beer segment is about 20 million barrels. So we have a long way to go, and I think there are going to be many years of growth. And I think the most successful companies are going to be the ones that stay independent, and that's what we're determined to do. My business partners will be the next generation of Brooklyn Brewery. We're not going to sell out.
Good to hear.
Hi, thanks for coming. Appreciate the talk a lot. I had the good fortune to be in Denmark earlier this year and really had a blast at McKellar and Friends and tasted some phenomenal stuff. I just wanted to get your view on internationally, what's the place to watch? Where do you think a lot of the cool stuff is happening outside of the U.S.? Thanks.
Well, we're, I think, the biggest exporter of craft beer. Last year, of our 220,000 barrels, about 28% was export. And our biggest markets are Scandinavia and the UK. We're doing really well in France. It's beginning to happen in Brazil in a big way, and Australia. And we just opened a brewery in Stockholm with Carlsberg. It's a partnership called New Carnegie Brewery by Brooklyn Brewery. If you go to Stockholm, you have to go visit. It's got a restaurant. It's really cool. You can get there by a ferry boat. So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in Scandinavia. We just did our MASH festival in London last week, and I was amazed. London now, there are 69 craft breweries in London. When I was in London in the 90s, when we first started selling there, most of the bars were tied houses, so they're controlled by the breweries. There were only a handful of free houses, which is a bar that can buy from anybody they want to buy from. Now there are countless free houses, and they're carrying American craft beer and British craft beer. And a lot of the tied houses are buying their way out of the relationships they have with the big breweries so they can carry craft beers. So we did an event at the Camden Town Brewery, which is, I think, Meantime and Camden are the two biggest among the London breweries. You got to go see this place if you're in London. A lot of the breweries are done where the cheapest rent is, not surprised. They're done in these arches under the rail trestles. Camden is unbelievable. They have like 8 arches. A lot of the arches you can't connect them because they're structural, but Camden you can. So they have all these arches. They have fermenters out in this alley, kind of under the catwalks for the trains up. I don't know how they ever got approval for this, And actually the guy from Camden said, well, what they don't know won't hurt them. And across the street now there are apartment buildings. But when they opened, it's kind of like what happened to us in Brooklyn. When they opened, there was nothing there. It was like a big empty lot across the street. So I think, there's really cool stuff happening in Denmark, in Sweden, in Norway. It's going to happen everywhere. And, I'm sure the Brazilians will come up with, a lot besides ant beer. Yes.
Hey, thanks so much for coming out. Just a quick question regarding actually the Reddit AMA thread. I read through that. And your number one piece of life advice was don't do business with assholes.
Yeah.
Followed up by a couple like separation agreements and stuff. Is there personal anecdotes or situations that happened that made this your number one piece of life advice? Or
Well, you know, with Reddit, you got to be on it, right? I think Milton Glaser is my designer. Milton's the guy who did the I Love New York logo. Very wise man. Milton's 85 years old now. You know, we've been working together for 30 years. And Milton is the one who basically, gave me that bit of advice many, many years ago, because he doesn't design for people he doesn't like. And it's been pretty good advice. And, you know, there have been cases where we have done business with people who we didn't really like, and, you know, usually it ends badly. There are a lot of big retailers who basically will say to me, look, I'll pay you this for your beer. You know, like your keg price is $100. We're going to pay 75. And your face, you know that you're selling to hundreds of people for $100. And here's this jerk telling you, no, I'm going to buy for 75. And your best customers are paying the full price. Now, a lot of brewers will deal with people like that. I don't. I couldn't live with myself if I'm selling to my better customers at this higher price and I'm giving this jerk a price for 70. And, you know, I've seen it happen. It doesn't pay off in the long run. So anyway, not to get carried away with that, I think it's pretty good advice. Maybe unavoidable sometimes. But yeah.
Hey there. Thanks for coming out. I actually had a follow-up question on one of the early ones about breweries in areas with rents really low.
With what?
In how breweries tend to go for areas with really low rents.
Yeah.
I think my parents would be worried for me if I started a brewery there. Do you know people, does it usually work out okay for the brewers? Or?
Well, our first warehouse was in Bushwick, off Bushwick Avenue on Messerol, in an old brewery building. And truck drivers would not come in there after dark. You know, these big truck drivers would call in and say, we'll be there in the morning. We're not coming this afternoon. And most mornings when we came in to open up, there were junkies across the street in this little Needle Park. But, you know, I had been in Beirut and Baghdad, so, you know, I could handle it. But it's true. I mean, all the craft brewers in London are in very dicey kind of neighborhoods. I did an event in D.C., part of our MASH thing, recently, and it was in a really skeezy part of D.C. So that's kind of the way it is. I mean, that's, you know, you're manufacturing. You can't afford to pay $20 a foot for your rent. You know, you got to go where it's $3 a foot. So. Yeah, you know, but my parents were thrilled that I had come back to the USA. You know, actually, my father did not understand or believe in journalism. I mean, he was thrilled when he said, I'm going into business. It was like, finally, you make some money with that Cornell degree. You know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you all very much. I'd be happy to sign some books if you want. And if you have further questions, have a nice day. Do you want to know about the beers? Yeah. So that wheat beer, Brooklyn Green Market Wheat, we do that with Grow NYC, the company, the not-for-profit company that runs all the farmers market, 53 farmers markets in New York City. And it's made with 70% local ingredients. So the grain is grown in upstate New York. There's some barley from Massachusetts in that beer. And we're committed to growing that brand. So we had a wheat beer called Brooklyn Weiss, which we got rid of, and that's our main wheat beer now. And part of the proceeds goes to the Grow NYC of every bottle we sell of that beer. And they sell it at the green markets, and they make all the retail markup on that. So it's our way of, supporting farmers, and we're hoping the farmers upstate are going to grow more grain every year so we can produce more of this beer and take it beyond New York State. The other beer, Brooklyn Cuvée Noir, is a strong stout that we age in bourbon barrels. It's also got a little sweet orange peel in it. It's aged in bourbon barrels for more than 6 months, and it's part of our barrel age series. Every quarter we have a different bottled beer that's aged in bourbon barrels or wine barrels or whatever. I think the last one was Wild Streak, which is basically a version of Local One aged in bourbon barrels and finished off with the Brettanomyces yeast. Brettanomyces creates sour flavors in the beer. So that's part of our, kind of innovation series of beers. We don't really call it that, but that's what it's all about. Actually, we just took a big warehouse in the Navy Yard to expand our barrel aging program because the little warehouse we had over near the brewery, we outgrew it. So you're going to see some exciting beers come out of that series, and I hope you liked Cuvée Noir. And if you go on our website, there's a great video that Garrett did, Garrett, our brewmaster, about Cuvée Noir, and it's kind of like a Dashiell Hammett sort of scene. Garrett's a great performer as well as a great brewer. Thank you very much.